This is the 7th seminar of the Cambridge Disaster Research Network. And if you haven't attended one before, this network was established last year to connect researchers from across disciplines, from across departments, not only across Cambridge, but also for those outside of Cambridge and those outside of academia. I'm Rory. I'm one of the early career postdoc conveners of the network, along with Camilla, Hannah, Milena, and Sarah. And we hope that this network will be an informal way for us to share, but also to connect with each other. So today's topic is on animals and disasters. It was raised in one of the discussions after a seminar last term. And this is really what we hope would happen, that these conversations would branch out a little bit. And we're lucky to have two great speakers today. Our first is Mihai Swift. Mihai is a PhD student on the NERC Doctoral Training Partnership in London. She investigates the relationships between animals, people, and volcanic hazards, and focusing on animal disaster planning, health impacts, and geohazard interactions. She works both in the volcanology team at the Natural History Museum, as well as in the geography department at King's College London. And she trained as a veterinary surgeon and has worked as a general practitioner in the UK for a number of years. Our second speaker is Donelle Gadenne. Donelle is a qualified veterinary nurse, and she's worked in the veterinary industry in Australia for over 20 years. She has a Masters of Arts degree in English from the University of Canterbury within the New Zealand Centre for Animal Human Studies. And she is co-author along with Professor Annie Potts of the book, Animals and Emergencies, Learning from the Christchurch Earthquakes, which she's going to be talking about today. And she's currently completing a PhD at Edge Hill University, researching veganism in the UK veterinary profession. So in terms of structure today, Mihai is going to give a brief introduction to the topic and to the field of animals and disasters. And then Donelle's going to follow with presenting her research of the Christchurch case study. And then after that, it's back to Mihai, who's going to present her PhD research case study. And then at the end, we're going to have time for questions for both speakers. So if you do think of a question during the talks, please save it until the end. And finally, as was mentioned in the emails about the talk, we'd like to also have a discussion and an exchange about your experiences of animals in disasters. With that in mind, if possible, it would be great if you could think about a number of questions about how animals and disasters interact. And I'm going to drop that into the chat now. So yes, if it applies and if you're happy to share, there's no pressure to share at all. You could think about how your research or your personal experiences have been shaped by animals in disasters, and what influence did animals have either on the disaster or your experience of it, and what can we learn from this? Because this is obviously a unique group, so it'd be great to have some exchange and some sharing of perspectives. So I'm now going to hand over to Mihai. So over to you, Mihai.
Great, thanks very much, Rory. I'll just share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that now. Great, lovely. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Rory. So, animals in disaster. Ooh, there we go. Yeah, so I just want to give everyone a brief introduction to the current state of research in this field. It's not something that people have necessarily conceived of from a specific academic perspective before, but I'm sure many people will have at least anecdotal tales that they've heard of, and potentially some research experience as well. But let's think, why would we study animals in disaster? I mean, for me, I came at this topic from quite a personal perspective. I've been a practicing veterinary surgeon for a number of years in the UK, and I specialised as an emergency vet, dedicated emergency vet for a number of years. And during my training, I started to learn about the impacts of large hazards, particularly in the US, such as Hurricane Katrina, and started to hear about, the issues of pet loss and the hugely damaging effect this had, not just obviously on animal welfare itself, but the horrific impacts that people suffered because of being separated from and losing their pets during disaster. So that's what brought me to the field and to this PhD. Why should we study animals in disaster? Overall, animals are extremely important in hazard and disaster contexts. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there. Many of you may have some sort of anecdotes to share with us. But looking in the media, or if you go out in the field and actually talk to people, about their experiences, the animals that people are living with and working with and depending on are always coming up in hazard and disaster discussions. Despite this, they tend to be absent from most disaster planning processes and policies globally. So there's this real gap between this need to consider animals and the fact that they're not really considered for planning at all. There are some notable exceptions around the world. They are few and far between, and it's still quite superficial, the inclusion of animals in policy. Alongside this, there's been relatively little research, but this is really starting to change. It started in the early 2000s, as we're about to see, and particularly in the past 5 to 10 years, this field of research is really starting to take off. It is a highly interdisciplinary subject, so there's no such sort of specific field. You can go to uni and study animals in disaster. I don't know, maybe that could change in the future, which would be awesome. But obviously, it relates to an awful lot of academic subjects that many of us here will be members of or familiar with. So from the sciences, anything from animal welfare, veterinary medicine, veterinary studies, and infectious disease studies, through to physical hazards, and then also looking more towards the social sciences and humanities, looking at impacts on people, behavior during disaster, communication studies. So, all aspects of disaster, I think you could insert animals into pretty much all of them with some relevance. So let's think about the history of animals and disaster research. What research has there been out there? Well, really, until about the past 20 years, animals were barely considered at all in academic research for disaster. But when they were, it was very much from, something that many of us will be familiar with as disaster researchers, this kind of techno-rational disaster risk reduction paradigm. So very much quite a scientific or quantitative focus. And in terms, which animals, we're talking very much just economic species. So, framing animals as economic units during disaster. So, is it worth us evacuating them financially or not? Thinking about animals as a collective herd, again, very much economic species, do we evacuate them? Are there routes? Can we model the evacuation? And then also thinking of them from a One Health perspective. So specifically framed as a potential biomedical hazard for human beings. So that could be through zoonotic disease, spread of zoonotic disease around disaster, for example, in evacuation shelters, but also, other potential aspects such as emissions of radioactive particles. Some studies post Fukushima disaster in Japan have looked at this. Key thing to know whether or not they could safely reunite people with their pets was whether or not radioactive particle emission was reducing sufficiently or not. So, quite a scientific, quite a rationalist approach to animals. These have obviously great value, and I certainly wouldn't deny that at all. It's important to have these studies available, and I think we still need more of them. However, a key issue with all of these types of studies is they're really quite dissociated from effective human-animal interactions. There's really no consideration at all, or almost no consideration within these of human-animal relationships, bonds, and how this might impact upon the whole disaster setup, whole disaster situation or hazard situation. There's also very little consideration of animals within this paradigm beyond livestock, the economic species. So, what are we going to do about this? What do we do about human-animal relationships? Well, from the early 2000s onwards, there started to be a little bit of research recognizing the importance of animals to their owners from a more affective, emotional perspective. So, these initial papers, they were quite basic, but still very important, quite groundbreaking. Will people stay or will they go during evacuation? So looking at some very contained disaster scenarios in the US, just looking statistically at people's, reported attachment to their animals and whether or not they would fail to evacuate or had failed to evacuate. Is pet ownership basically a risk factor for evacuation failure? So, really important studies showing what, the results. I think we can probably all guess that, of course, pets are very important for evacuation failure. But then really it was the event of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 that really pushed the academic research on. Obviously, many of you as disaster researchers will be quite familiar with this disaster. It's been hugely studied from all sorts of perspectives. I'd just like to draw your attention to one key event during this disaster, which was Snowball the dog and his owner. So this was a little boy of about 6-7 years of age, was one of the people that had to evacuate, was taken through federal structures for evacuation. And he was carrying his little dog, Snowball, a little Shih Tzu type dog, like the one we see in the picture here. I don't believe this is actually Snowball, but it's the closest approximation I could find of an image. And when it was time to get on the evacuation bus, the federal agents in charge of evacuation basically turned around to this little boy and said, "No, sorry, your dog isn't allowed." And I believe the event was filmed, and the poor little boy was screaming, "Snowball, Snowboy." He got so upset that he vomited, and he had to leave Snowball the dog behind. And to my knowledge, some people have suggested that they've been reunited since, but looking into it, it does seem unlikely, unfortunately. Along with thousands of other human-animal bonds, it seems unlikely Snowball was reunited with his owners, but he got left behind. But a very interesting thing that happened in the US in the result of this was this particular event went very viral. The following year, there was bipartisan support of the US Congress for the PETS Act, which pretty much obliges federal disaster agencies in the US to try and support animal evacuation where possible. So allowing them onto buses, allowing them into shelters, all key things that were not happening during Hurricane Katrina. And in the wake of this, not only has there been great policy change in the US, but there's also been a lot more academic interest and a lot more funding for research. And so we're starting to see now a higher volume of papers and a greater methodological breadth for these papers as well. So post-Hurricane Katrina, what kinds of things are we seeing in the research? Well, for the first time, we started to see people looking into how socioeconomic context and human vulnerability interacted with pet ownership. So human-animal bonds started to be considered as one of many microfactors for evacuation risk. Socioeconomic status, race, age as risk factors for pet loss. For example, one study has found that Black single mothers of a lower socioeconomic status in the US were at higher risk of facing severe psychological consequences from experiencing pet loss. And these psychological consequences have been demonstrated in other studies as well. So, not just acute stress, but also depression, post-traumatic stress syndrome, peritraumatic dissociation. And I'm sure Donelle's going to be talking about these with regard to the Christchurch emergency in her talk as well. So these are great papers, they really moved the field on. However, they were still mostly undertaken within quite a positivist, realist framework. So quite an epidemiological approach to the research, quite statistical. It's also worth noting that human-animal bonds, although it's great that pets were starting to be considered, it was quite a limited notion of the human-animal bond. It was very limited to the Western idea of pet keeping. A little bit of focus on horse ownership, but mostly just small animals, pets in a pet kind of ownership structure. But in the last decade, we've really started to see research expand much further beyond this. So there's been a lot more consideration of pre-disaster planning. So not just the actual logistics of what goes on during disaster and evacuation, but actually starting to think about about education and about using animal ownership as a route for education. So there's also been a focus on the idea that decision making in disaster is not just undertaken by individuals, so by owners, but of course a lot of agencies can be involved. A lot more focus on other types of human-animal bonds, so particularly large animals, horses. Still, we're seeing livestock, I would say, is underrepresented in the research. And I think a key thing we need to remember is that even though livestock have significant economic value to their keepers, to farmers, to governments, there is, of course, a really strong affective relationship. And I was just saying, actually, with the conveners before we started, of course, we've just seen the 20-year anniversary of the foot and mouth crisis here in the UK. And many of you will remember that. And of course, the impact on farmers was enormous. And even where there was financial compensation available, horrific mental health tolls, many farmers unfortunately driven close to suicide, and some did take their lives. So we have to remember that even though species may be farmed, we can't discount the fact that actually there's a lot more going on with the human-animal bond than there's simply an economic relationship. We're also starting to see in the past decade some more imaginative conceptions of how we could research human and animal bonds during disaster and hazard. So instead of framing pets or animals as a risk factor, So, how can we utilize animal-related networks as avenues for disseminating information during disaster, as well as education beforehand? There's an idea, lovely paper about psychographic profiling for detecting clusters of different owner types. So, the key with this paper is, of course, just because various people own, say, a dog, it doesn't necessarily mean they have the same type of human-animal relationship with that dog. And actually, if we can work out how to profile different clusters of owner type, then maybe we can use this to target disaster advice campaigns at a local level as well. So some great research starting to be done. And also the focus very much shifting towards Australia as well. I mean, you'll see one of the pictures here very clearly, an animal rescue agent trying to catch a koala in the recent Australia bushfires, which are obviously a pretty horrific animal disaster. But Australia has been quite a key country for some of this more recent research. But there are some ongoing limitations and lots of space for us to improve and carry on with the direction of research. So it is very Western centric. And again, this is an issue obviously with all disaster research anyway. This is no different with animals in disaster. We've had a couple of more recent papers have highlighted this issue. We've started to see a few papers looking beyond Western countries. So there's a paper looking at self-predicted disaster behavior, for example, in a few Latin American countries, or looking at pet evacuation post-Fukushima in Japan. But these are still within quite a positivistic framework. But there's a lot more work to do to look at the most vulnerable regions of the world. There's still quite a prominent focus on pet keepers, and so we need to consider effective impacts, as I said, for all other species, so not just farmed horses, but also considering other types of animal ownership and formal animal ownership, such as zoos. But then also looking at animals that are not owned, so wild animals or stray populations. And again, particularly when we get outside the Western context, stray populations, where they're not exactly wild, they are dependent in some way upon human population and human interaction. It's not an official, formal animal ownership structure, but it is still a very important affective human-animal interaction. And again, thinking even further as well, beyond this Western notion of human-animal relationships as animals as property, and trying to tie this in with course to decolonize research, and particularly within animal geographies, there's a call now to decolonize animal geography. Within human animal studies as well, and this is Donelle's background, this is her field, so I'm sure she could give us more information about this, but certainly there'll be calls to decolonize the research in there. So thinking about ways in which we could do this with animals and disaster research. So another key thing, so when I started my PhD, I came from quite a scientific background, and I started to plan my research in that way. The one thing that really struck me, even before I went out to do my fieldwork in Mexico, was a lot of people, scientists I was meeting, for example, at conferences and other settings. When I mentioned that I was going to be studying animals in disaster, the first thing that got said to me is, animals can sense hazards, can't they? They can predict them. And this really struck me, particularly when it came from people who were scientists, and in some cases, hazard scientists, using the word prediction, it was quite noticeable. But this is something that comes up time and again. Can animals sense or predict or communicate the presence or the start of hazards to us? So there are an enormous number of anecdotal reports, and many of you may have heard some of these, may have some to share with us later. Is there any validity from a scientific perspective? I would say certainly yes. For example, reports of, pet species sensing seismic tremors before their owners have, we could certainly imagine they may be more sensitive to certain environmental stimuli. We might see behavioral changes because of that. Birds, again, flocks of birds taking off at the beginning of earthquakes before people could feel them is quite a classic one that's reported. The actual academic literature that's available on this topic is minimal, and where it's scientific literature, it is very poor quality. So some interesting papers that have really fallen into the fallacy of assuming that correlation equals causation and these sorts of things. So there's no good academic literature, certainly that I found, that's really quite that gives a confident evidence to support this from a scientific perspective. However, I would argue that just because we don't necessarily have a scientific basis, either because we don't have it yet or because there simply isn't one, I think it's important to consider that we shouldn't discount knowledges, beliefs, and mythologies of animal hazard connections beyond just a purely rationalistic scientific network. And this is something I'm going to touch upon when I talk about my research in Mexico, but just something to throw out there at the beginning here. And then finally, what about the future? So some things for everyone to consider, perhaps for our questions at the end. So considering, will decision making for animals always be made by individuals? I think, we can say that certainly various agencies are involved in different countries, so probably not. How can we include this in our research? Does animal attachment necessarily determine disaster behavior? So measures of animal attachment are a really classic thing that a lot of animals in disaster studies have used. They're not necessarily, though, obviously going to be predictive of behavior during a natural hazard or disaster event. And we have to also consider, one paper's looked at whether or not there might be different moral assessments by different stakeholders, which again may sway what behaviors we see from people during disasters. Looking towards the future as well, starting to reframe animals, particularly from a human animals perspective, rather than animals being an object upon which, an object we own and upon which we do things, framing them as beings in their own right with agency. And again, this is something that's been quite key in my own research, the framework of my own research. But, for example, animals might influence people's social identity or their ecological perspectives or ideological stances, which may in turn influence the disaster risks, perceptions, or knowledges. So again, just an example of how this could be the case. Context specificity is really essential, as it is, I'm sure, with all aspects of disaster studies. Thinking as well, again, some of you will be very familiar with the No Natural Disasters campaign, which I fully support. But within that, the way I've often presented it in the past to people is, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. You can't have disaster without people. But actually, maybe we could reconceptualize this. Can we have a disaster with no people? What if there's a disaster event which severely impacts animals, even if it isn't impacting on people, at a direct level? Perhaps they're not becoming ill or dying during disaster, but animals are. Is this a disaster? So perhaps we need to be a bit more nuanced when we conceptualize the idea of disaster. And then just finally, can we think of inclusion of animals in disaster work as a potential route to decolonization of practices? So not only our research practices, but actually policy, how we implement policy, how we design and implement it. And, is there a route in some cases for improving social justice, using animals in disaster focus as a route to this? So I think that's everything from me for the introduction. Thanks very much for your attention.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mihai. That was fantastic. If anyone came in late, just a reminder that we're saving discussions and questions until the end. So with that, I'm going to hand over now to Donelle.
Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. Yeah. I'll just put my screen off. Sorry, everyone. Lovely. Am I good to go?
Perfect.
Thank you. Sorry about that, technology and me. And firstly, I wanted to say thank you for organising this seminar today, to Rory and Mihai for inviting me to speak about the animals and emergencies and the Christchurch City earthquakes, and also to the conveners and everybody who has come along to listen. Thank you very much. So I'll begin by providing some background and context. So this talk is, and the book that's come out of it is basically revolving around two major earthquakes that happened in Christchurch, New Zealand. And we've just had the 10-year anniversary of the February 2011 earthquake. The first, however, was at 4:35 a.m. on Saturday, the 4th of September 2010. And that earthquake measured 7.1 on the Richter scale. It hit New Zealand in Christchurch on the South Island. It lasted around 40 seconds, and although it was centred near Christchurch, which is on the east coast of the South Island, it was actually felt quite far north of the North Island. So extremely big earthquake. It's generally reported that no lives were lost as a result of that earthquake. However, thousands of non-human animals were affected and died as a result. And of course, it caused widespread damage. Being quite early in the morning, most people would have we can probably say that they were likely in bed. And that may have had something to do with, maybe in some degree protecting people. Whereas the second earthquake, which was 5 months later, that was at 12:51 p.m. on Tuesday, the 22nd of February, 2011. So that was a working day. So it was a very busy time in the city, sort of midday lunchtime. And it was subsequent to the first earthquake and far more devastating in terms of the time that it hit. It was 6.3 in magnitude, but quite shallow and directed underneath the city business district. So as a result of the second earthquake, the major earthquake, 185 people lost their lives, and thousands of others were affected, and potentially, if not likely even to this day, there are still consequences of that. So that second earthquake caused vast infrastructural damage, affecting and damaging both residential homes and the commercial premises, especially in the city centre, where it was sort of located underneath there. So that February the 22nd earthquake affected thousands of non-human animal lives, both on that day, but also from that day. So although the impact of the earthquake on the day is catastrophic, the consequences of these events can last days, weeks, months, and potentially years. And for people, I guess, decades if it involves loss, even of non-human life. So there were thousands of aftershocks as well. So in terms of the initial earthquakes, the aftershocks were an ongoing, I guess, terror that people had to live with, and also non-human animals would have experienced those aftershocks as well. So from a pre-existing traumatic moment, thereafter came a series of recurrent traumatic moments that literally lasted for many, many years. So around the time of the earthquake, there were stories that were circulating around Christchurch about domestic and wild animals, but very few of them were told or recalled or recorded in great detail. So there were newspaper stories that were coming out, but they tended to represent, I suppose, the more extraordinary accounts of animal stories, like cats who had run away and came back after a long period of time. Dogs predicting aftershocks. They were the kind of stories that were coming out. At the time, my co-author on the book, Annie Potts, who is from Christchurch or lived in Christchurch, saw the need to present some of these stories in more depth. Alongside the everyday descriptions of as well, in terms of how various species, so dogs, cats, but also horses, chickens, hedgehogs, turtles, parrots, how they all responded and were impacted by those earthquakes. So I became involved in this research in 2013, after the project had already been initiated by Annie Potts, who is at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. I was a master's student at the time, and I became involved in the project as a summer scholarship recipient. But unlike Annie, I wasn't in Christchurch at the time when the earthquakes happened, and I didn't arrive there until 2 years afterwards. Even then, I remember when I arrived, the damage to the city was really evident, because walking around, there were still buildings that were cordoned off. The city business district still had the marks on the doors where they had been searched by emergency workers, and they were not to be entered again. It didn't look like anyone had been back there. This was 2 years on. And they were still quite dangerous to walk near. And there were lots of areas of the sort of suburban outskirts that had been damaged by liquefaction, and they were called red zone. So they had been deemed not to be rebuilt. And at the time I was there, the houses had been evacuated and abandoned, but they were still there. And many of them, the nature was reclaiming them, I guess, growing through people's gardens, growing through their windows and things like that. But I do recall watching the February 22nd earthquake from my then home in Australia, and I was watching the live sort of immediate aftermath of that being filmed, and the devastation, not knowing at the time, of course, that I would be moving there to live and study just a few years later. So this research began as a project aimed at collecting animal earthquake stories, basically, and that was in 2012-13, and in 2014 it became a book. So the research that went into the book, which you can see on my slide there, was conducted over 3 years. using interviews, email correspondence. We used online archives and media reports. And it's structured in 2 sections. So the first section covers rescues, shelter, advocacy agencies, and it presents the experiences of the frontline responders and shelter and advocacy workers. And the second part of the book presents the animal earthquake story, starting with dogs and cats. So in this section, we talk to people who had anecdotal personal experiences of how the earthquakes affected them, their human, non-human animal relationship, and the animals in their lives that they care for. But also we look at other species, not just dogs or cats, although they're prominent and they feature as probably the largest 2 species categories that we look at. We also talk about rats, people who were rescuing rats, rat rescue, hedgehogs. There was a lady who was rescuing hedgehogs who were terribly impacted by liquefaction as well. Obviously, because they live on the ground and burrow down holes around people's houses, the foundations of houses and things like that. Birds, lots of birds. So we were talking to people about their caged birds experiences. Eels. So Christchurch has an eel population in Avon River. And of course, the river was affected by pipes that polluted the river. And in addition to that, the riverbed was disrupted by the seismic activity, and that affected the animals living in the water in the river, the fish and the eels. So they're all included in that part 2. And the final section of part 2 discusses the most vulnerable categories of non-human animals, and that's those confined to laboratories or on factory-style farms. So I do want to highlight some of the lessons learned, since that's the title of the book, and I think is what is most useful. But I thought, firstly, it might be good to mention that it emerged that there were several things that went really well, and I do want to mention those. So in emergencies affecting both rural and urban communities, effective communication across agencies is essential. Mihai did mention that, importance of interagency involvement. Many organisations and individuals did unite to assist with the initial response to animals and their rescue and rehabilitation in Christchurch. And it emerged that strong interagency and cross-community cooperation results in effective rescue response for non-human species. And this slide here that I'm showing you lists the many kinds of groups and organisations that played a crucial role in helping animals affected by the earthquakes. And then the community. So down the bottom, I've got members of the community, and the community really stepped up in Christchurch, and help came from so many different directions. The people looked after animals whose families had evacuated homes and hadn't taken animals with them. People rescued abandoned kittens from damaged buildings, or they fed homeless strays in the evacuated and abandoned red zone areas of the city. People offered to walk and play with the displaced dogs that were housed at the rescue organisations and the shelters. And local people, also throughout New Zealand and overseas, searched online to match missing pets with found animals on internet databases. And all those things are certainly by no means insignificant, because even though the other agencies, together and combined played an enormous role in facilitating response and rescue, even just the individual actions of community members made a really big difference as well. Many companies and individuals donated money. Of course, money is very important to funding rescue, response and rehabilitation for non-human animals. And they also donated services to transport food for animals, pet food, and house quake-affected animals. So lots of people and organisations were able to help with the funding and provision of places for the animals to stay. People rescued and rehabilitated urban wildlife. As I mentioned, there was the lady who rescued the hedgehog. And hundreds of people in Christchurch and around New Zealand fostered or permanently adopted animal earthquake refugees as well. Despite all that went well, however, there were lessons to be learned. So there was already a substantial and growing body of research into the effects of disasters on animals and humans' relationships with them. Largely, of course, notably is Hurricane Katrina outcomes and the work of sociologist Leslie Irvine on that disaster. So for example, some of the things that came out with the importance of evacuating animals alongside their human families wherever possible, and the need for pet-friendly post-disaster accommodation. That was another thing that came forward as very important. A huge number of animals were abandoned post-Hurricane Katrina, and many people chose to leave without their animals. Also, many who had wanted to take their animals with them had been forced to leave those pets behind by those ordering the evacuations. So these sort of converging scenarios can result in catastrophe for animals. So I thought I'd just go through a couple of those sort of key lessons, the first of those being evacuation. And Glassy and Wilson, so Steve Glassy and his co-author, they've emphasised the necessity to evacuate companion animals alongside their human guardians, because otherwise both humans and other animals are placed at greater risk. So they point out in their 2010 article how during international disasters, failure to include animals in civil defence emergency evacuation plans results in evacuation non-compliance. So people refusing to leave their homes without their pets. This resulted in illegal re-entries to dangerous areas, so when people go back to retrieve animals. And it can lead to detrimental psychosocial outcomes stemming from forced abandonment and separation. So people are more likely to attempt risky re-entries into hazardous areas if they have had to leave pets behind. And this was the case in Christchurch when it was reported that people breached cordons in order to retrieve companion animals from the central business district, city centre, following the earthquake on the 22nd of February 2011. So re-entry into such areas risks not only the lives of those returning to search for animals, but also any rescuers required subsequently to escort cordon breakers from that region. And it's also, I guess as a result of that, vital that disaster management plans and practices take into account the importance of non-human animals kept as companions in people's homes. And as Mihai said, recognise the human-animal bond, if not in and of itself as being important, but in terms of disaster and management, in terms of reducing risk to the non-human animals, people going back who may choose to risk themselves retrieving those pets, and of course to people who have to then go in and potentially help those people as well. The second issue I raised was accommodation. And this is related to evacuation in many ways. So many people in Christchurch who had to abandon their homes at short notice were forced to surrender their companion animals. And unless they had the option of living with friends or family who could also take in their pets, then they found themselves in a tricky situation. It was difficult to find pet-friendly emergency accommodation. And this was not only an issue in the immediate aftermath of the February 2011 earthquake, as people left their homes in an emergency immediate sort of situation, but also for many years after, as people were searching for rental properties that maybe weren't pet friendly, as they were waiting for their own homes to be rebuilt so that they could reoccupy those. So this does emphasise the importance of ensuring post-disaster pet-friendly accommodation options for people with dogs or perhaps fish, rabbits or birds. However, for cats, it can be a little bit different. So rescue agency staff that we spoke to often suggested that cats are sometimes best left in situ rather than moved from their familiar territories or to short-term accommodation with their human companions. Of course, this would apply only if there was somebody who could look after the cat left in situ, to somebody, maybe a neighbour who could after the cat, provide fresh water and food, or if somebody from the cat's human family was able to return to that premises and feed and check the fresh water for the cat on a daily basis. But yeah, some professionals do endorse this as sometimes being a less traumatic option for cats rather than relocating them. But of course, I think this would also depend on the nature of the individual cat. I myself had 2 cats at one point. One would have been fine with that. The other one may probably have preferred to be at home with me going back there. So they're different. They're not homogenous. They all have their own unique personalities. The cats They do tend to stay within their home territory. So even those that are sort of more attached to their people than their territory, they would still, probably establish a kind of territory where they live. So even if they initially run away in fear, they're more likely to return to their homes when things settle rather than go somewhere else. So it's for this reason that at the time of the Christchurch earthquakes, the SPCA was recommending that people who had evacuated their homes and couldn't find their cats at the time or if people weren't permitted to take them to temporary accommodation, to ask neighbours to look out for those cats and provide fresh water and feed them. So another really important lesson that came out of the book, which isn't unique to the Christchurch earthquakes, but also something that had arisen as a known way to mitigate some of the issues with reunification post-disaster, is the importance of microchipping. So those who have animals microchipped are more likely to be reunited with their dogs and cats who fled in response to the disaster. Animals without microchips, of course, and it seems logical, but they're much less likely to find their way back home or to be returned quickly, if at all. So microchipping is a pretty simple measure that can better protect animals when disasters happen. Dogs and cats who were microchipped prior to the quakes in Canterbury were easily identified. Emergency rescue organisations, veterinary hospitals, councils tend to have microchip scanners, and then they, can just run the scanner over the animal companion, and the microchip number comes up as a one link identification for that individual animal. So they can be quickly returned to their homes from which they've fled, which was a very common reaction for the cats based on conversations we had with people in the book. So the New Zealand Press Association reported that 85% of microchipped animals were returned to their human carers post-quakes, compared with just a rate of just 15% reunion for non-microchipped animals. I think it's important that microchipping is only effective if people's contact details are kept up to date with the microchip registration organisations or companies as well. Often there are multiple databases in particular places. One unified database is obviously ideal, but where that isn't the case, I know in Australia we had a couple of different ones. We had Australian Animal Registry, we had Companion Animal, we had just a few different ones. Unfortunately, people have to maybe make sure that their pets' microchips are registered with all of those companies or know which one they are registered with. So Mihai did mention psychological sort of consequences of disasters in terms of human-animal relationships. There was a whole section that we talked about in the book that we presented in the book as a result of something that arose in terms of a theme as a result of the research that we conducted, and that was people not being able to be comfortable in terms of moving on until they were reunited with their companion animals, particularly if they had lost a pet who was missing, and this kind of catharsis that was felt, this release of emotion when people were reunited or found their way back with them. But I didn't actually prepare a section on that, but it was something that I was reminded of when Mihai was talking. But I am going to talk about disenfranchised grief. So disasters can result in the loss of companion animals through disappearance or death, and this can have a profound effect on humans. So when discussing animals and emergencies, I think it is crucial to bear in mind that the guardians of these animals can be deeply psychologically affected, and there's this issue of disenfranchised grief. So this refers to this profound bereavement experienced by many for absent loved animals. It's not readily acknowledged or validated in wider society, including our workplaces. The bereavement for non-human species often remains trivialised and underestimated in Western anthropocentric culture. And disenfranchised grief is further complicated when it occurs because of disasters that may have also taken human lives and destroyed homes and communities. And it's been quite controversial even to talk about non-human animal suffering when humans are suffering at the same time. But that can be a sort of tricky thing to juggle for people. There's a quote on the screen there from one of our participants down the bottom that I think encapsulates that really well. So a failure to appreciate the significance of companion animal loss can occur at many levels and in diverse situations, but it's fundamentally the consequence of a culture that places human-animal relationships in a hierarchy under or in competition with human-human ones. So when something occurs that threatens or impacts on human-animal relationship, people may offer less sympathy or less sincere sympathy than if the relationship were traditionally held in high esteem. Or more respected within culture. So a lot of people may struggle with expressing feelings of deep grief or loss or trauma over an issue with a non-human animal, with their human families, friends, or wider society, or in their workplaces as well. And the fact that Western culture diminishes the importance of animal death may exacerbate the sense of despair when a companion animal dies, especially for more vulnerable people having experienced extreme stress, such as the elderly or maybe children, young children. And given the nature of our relationships with animal companions, it stands to reason that they figure even more significantly during times of illness, bereavement, separation, divorce, and of course during recovery from disasters as well. So yeah, the death, disappearance, or forced relinquishment of a cherished companion animal as a consequence of a disaster, such as an earthquake, inevitably compounds the trauma associated with this event. I did just quickly want to mention the second part of the second half of the book, which I mentioned, was a discussion of some of the most vulnerable animals in society. So animals at greatest risk in disasters like earthquakes are those confined or incarcerated. And this includes horses kept in stables, fish and turtles kept in aquariums, birds in cages, or dogs kept in cages, they call them crates, as well as animals kept in maybe boarding kennels, catteries, or in pet shops. So these animals are particularly vulnerable because they can't escape independently. So it's chapter 6 of the book where we discuss animals in society who are most vulnerable when disasters happen. And here I just wanted to mention those living in confinement in laboratories and on factory farms. So while animal companions often receive some attention when affected by disasters, it's important not to overlook the fate of thousands of non-companion animal species who were also affected by the earthquakes. So these utility animals, I'm using scare quotes there, utility animals, especially those subject to intensive farming practices, they're often the ones at the greatest risk of injury, suffering, or death when disasters happen, if they're in small confined spaces with no ability to react however they see fit in response to the earthquake. And the earthquake did affect thousands of animals kept in New Zealand scientific and medical laboratories. University departments often have housed animals there, such as zoology, biochemistry, physiology, psychology departments often use animals for the purposes of experimentation or teaching. Contact with these animals is restricted in normal times, and their everyday lives, as well as the experiments conducted on them, are usually obscured from the public and underplayed in the media. So it's no surprise that their fate during disasters is also routinely unpublicised. When reports do occur, as Leslie Irvine explained in discussing Hurricane Katrina, and also Mihai mentioned, such losses tend to be discussed in terms of economic or production loss. While dogs and cats are sort of valued for their unique personalities and companionship, they're often considered part of the family. Animals farmed for food in Western societies are valued primarily in economic terms. So the deaths of farmed animals count not in terms of the loss of living beings, but insofar as they impact on human livelihoods, as well as on regional and national economies. In emergencies, the impact on animals kept in laboratories receives even less media attention than the fate of farmed animals. So the animals that humans use and consume require as much, if not more, consideration with respect to safety and welfare during emergencies as do our companion animals. While few people have emotional connections to these intensively farmed or experimental animals, they're the beings that we've made most vulnerable in the event of a disaster. And I think it's precisely for this reason you know, the reason that we've decided to use and consume these animals for the benefit of our own species, that we're obliged to protect, rescue and care for them too. But I did just want to mention that as like a personal, something that's very important to me in terms of the research that we did. And then just to finish, I thought I'd offer some more practical advice. So there were definitely key lessons learned that I did want to cover, those ones that I just sort of went through, that also highlight this information, which I think is really useful. It's drawn from Steve Glassey's Guide to Protecting Pets During Disasters. If you haven't or don't know about Steve Glassey, in terms of being an animal emergency welfare expert, definitely worth looking into some of his publications and work. We include his guide in our book as an appendix. So if you have animals that you care for, please consider making an animal emergency plan. You can find really excellent resources on the internet for this now. And I guess the ultimate lesson is that we need to prepare before disaster strikes. So this means things like ensuring that dogs and cats are microchipped, as I explained. It's important to ensure that they have another form of identification on them that's visible too, like an ID tag on collars. Keeping emergency stocks of pet food and some supply of, say, bottled clean water. We would probably keep that for ourselves as part of our emergency kit, but maybe an extra little bit for the companion animals if we have them. Ensuring there are sufficient pet carriers and leads for all animals in the case of evacuation. There have been studies that say people are less likely to evacuate if they have cats and don't have enough carriers for those cats, then they can't move them out of the property, they're more likely to stay. And ensuring adequate supplies of pets medication. That's something too that's very important because vet clinics are often also damaged in disasters and may not be able to supply medications as per normal. Every home needs to have a family emergency plan, which includes an emergency plan for each animal. They are unique individuals. Obviously, what you do with dogs may be different for cats, etc. And there should definitely be pet evacuation packs at the ready, something you can grab and go that has maybe a short supply of medication, some of your pet's food, any other things that you may need if you were to immediately evacuate the home. And it's also a really good idea to keep up-to-date photographs online of companion animals in case you need to put them on a reunification website or a database, and know where to go for temporary accommodation, allowing pets should the need arise as well. And just finally, again, just for me, let's continue to discuss and find ways to better protect and provide for all those already invisibilised animals in society who are most vulnerable when disasters strike. Sometimes that's the most difficult. Talking about what we should or could do for companion animals seems something we can more readily discuss and address. But in terms of what we do about these animals that are most vulnerable in society, can sometimes be more difficult, if not definitely important conversation to have. So that's all I have. Thank you. Some of my references.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Donelle. That was really great, fascinating. Now for the third and final section, I'm handing back to Mihai, who's going to present her case study.
Great, lovely. Thanks ever so much, Donelle. That was fantastic. Just share my screen again. There we go. Is that working?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, lovely. So I'm just going to talk a bit about my own PhD research now, which is still ongoing. So looking broadly at the human-animal geos interactions at the area at risk from Popocatépetl volcano in Mexico. So in this talk, I'm just going to give you an introduction to the case study region. I'm going to take some time to do this because it's an intensely complex area. I mean, I know, all disaster zones, we can think of complexity involving them, but this area, it's well studied, but there are an awful lot of factors to think about before we even start to think about the place of animals in disaster in this area. So I'm going to consider the hazards, sort of physical hazards in the region. I'm going to introduce you to the people in the region, to human-animal relationships, and then going to start thinking about evacuation, and then touch upon my research methodologies for my own work and the key findings so far. So Popocatépetl volcano. So I mean, first of all, why did I go here to do my research? It was partly just a very lucky situation where when I started my PhD program in London, I met my two primary supervisors, Amy Donovan and Chiara Petroni, who are both volcanologists and both have cats, and thought that this was a really important topic. And so they agreed that we would start to look for some volcanic hazards that also had relevance for animals in disaster. And we decided to focus upon Popocatépetl volcano. It has a reported history of animals being an issue for evacuation in the region. But just to introduce you, first of all, to the volcano itself in the region. So it's an active volcano, stratovolcano. It became active again in 1994 after a period of quiescence. It has regular emissions of gas and ash, occasional lahars, which are flows of mud, basically ash or mud remobilized by water, often rainwater, occasionally snow or glacier melt, although there's no more glacier on this particular volcano. It also has the potential for a Plinian scale eruption, which basically means a very large, very destructive, explosive eruption. And along with that, potentially some pyroclastic flows. So those are flows of hot ash and gas, which can travel up to 200 kilometers per hour down the sides of the volcano. So it's very active, and then the potential to have some very serious, incredibly damaging activity as well, on top of the current sort of more normal activity that we see most days. It is incredibly closely observed and monitored. It's one of the most monitored volcanoes in the world. So we have monitoring stations all around it. I've put here a screenshot of the YouTube channel. You can go and watch some of the live cams that actually, if you want to see the gas emissions in real time, you can. These are set up at a few different stations around the volcano. There's ash monitoring. Actually, the picture I've got there is one of my supervisors, Chiara, helping fix one of the ash monitoring stations when we were out on fieldwork a few years ago. And then it's also got a traffic light warning system. This is a contentious system because it's actually been stuck at the yellow phase, basically the middle risk phase of warning since activity started, pretty much. So again, there's a lot of debate, and there's been some literature on what is the usefulness of this? Is there perhaps fatigue with this system? But at least it exists. So it's a very interesting volcano just from a physical hazards perspective, and a lot of potential for danger to the people living around it. However, the volcano is not the only physical hazard in this area. It's also an incredibly active seismic region. So there was a major earthquake actually just the year before I went out to start my field work in 2017. There was a large earthquake that affected particularly Puebla and Mexico City. So this whole region that's a potential risk from the volcano as well. A lot of damage in the wake of that, but there's lower level seismic activity happening very regularly in this part of Mexico. In Mexico City, I'll come on to the human settlements in my next slide, but Mexico City, which is close by, also a significant portion of that, the central portion, is built on what was originally a lake bed. This region is sinking, and if you look at some of the historical buildings in the center of the city, you'll see they lean at some very funky angles. And there's also, of course, climate change, which is affecting the region. And then, beyond the more natural hazards, climate change arguably anthropogenic, then we've also then got the very much human hazards. So infrastructure failures, particularly in urban regions, drainage quite often is not sufficient. So flooding in urban regions is very common. Also to mention, again, sort of a crossover between human and natural hazards here, but there is a highly contested pipeline construction going on in this region. So there's a big water and gas pipeline. It's been in the pipeline, no pun intended, but it's been in development for many years now, not just with the current government, although they've certainly continued to support it from what I can gather. But it's nicknamed the pipeline of death by those who are resisting it. It is very contested, and it crosses directly through some of the risk regions for the volcano on the east side of the volcano. And some of the major issues some of the arguments made by scientists, hazard scientists, that with the development, the engineering, the pipeline has not been sufficient to take into account the seismic hazards in particular, and then also the volcanic hazards as well. So quite a lot going on from a physical hazards perspective in this area. But just to give you an idea now of the more social aspects, so hopefully you can see my mouse on the screen. So where I'm circling here, this is Popocatépetl volcano. This is the dormant Itza next door. But here's the volcano of interest. But we have two very major settlements. So first of all, we have Mexico City up here, an incredibly large urban settlement. And then we've also got Puebla City here, which is another major city of Mexico, just on the other side, on the east side. And between these two major settlements and the surrounding sort of more suburban and rural areas around the volcano, we have over 20 million people living at potential risk from the volcano. So obviously those who are closest on the slopes are more affected by the daily activity, gas emissions, lahars. But if there was a Plinian scale eruption, then both those major cities would certainly be at significant risk from ashfall in particular. So on the slopes of Popo, who have we got living in this area? So, well, I mean, in the urban areas, we have, they're incredibly diverse. Mexico City, many of you will be familiar with already. Anything from the very wealthy to the really quite poor, and it's the same in Puebla City. When we move to the more suburban rural regions, as we get closer to the slopes of Popocatépetl, we tend to move away from the middle classes, so towards the perhaps more socioeconomically disenfranchised classes of people, not exclusively, but in general. However, it's worth noting these are very heterogeneous communities of people. So there is a significant indigenous population. So Mexico has many, many different indigenous communities, and there are a number of these communities settled on the slopes or near the slopes of Popocatépetl volcano. But they are not the only people that live here. It's very heterogeneous. A lot of people have migrated to this rural area close to the volcano. In particular, there's been quite a lot of return migration from the US. So people who perhaps migrated to the US initially, who then decide to return to Mexico, but rather than going back to the sites that they'd originated from, there are many people are actually choosing to come here. There's a lot of land available. That itself is very contested as well, politically, etc. But there is return migration to this region. Another important thing to note is that the volcano has some significant spiritual significance to a number of people that live close by, and to some people who live further away in more urban zones but feel connected to the volcano. So it's part of a religious sort of a cult to Don Goyo, the father, the volcano. And just got a couple of pictures here. So I was very privileged to be able to attend a ceremony. A ceremony where people were going to give offerings to the volcano. So this is me standing inside the cave. This is on the slopes of Popo. So people coming inside, it's quite common to find caves like this around the volcano. So people coming inside and making offerings, and you'll probably recognize here the cross. So again, religion, it's not a religion that's exclusive to Christianity. It's really very much melded and meshed with Christianity. It's a form of Christian practice as well. So it's spiritual, but from a Christian basis as well. So just to be aware of that, the volcano is not just a physical hazard to many people. It is, to some people, a living being, and it has a lot of other cultural significance. Other social factors to mention in the area: crime networks are an increasing worry in this area. Obviously, I'm sure many people will be aware that Mexico has very severe security issues across the whole country, particularly with drugs gangs, narco trafficking. The violence has increased significantly over the past years, and crime networks have certainly spread into this region as well. So security is a concern for people that live here. There is low trust of the police and military, in many cases for very good reason. There have been well documented, if not necessarily officially acknowledged, abuses across the country, and this area is no different. Abuses by military or paramilitary or police bodies in particular, and ongoing contested land rights, particularly with who gets the right to build their houses. Okay, so a very diverse, quite complex region at risk from the volcano that we're studying. And now we need to think about the animals as well. So obviously, as you may have gathered from the diversity of people and human settlements, we've got a very diverse range of human-animal relationships in this area as well. So the first thing to say is that across Mexico in general, animal ownership is very prevalent. So we have multiple animals on average per household, much more than many Western countries, other Western countries such as the UK. And another thing to note is that the culture of owning a pet has really, really increased a lot over the past decade, especially in urban zones and amongst the middle classes. But even stretching beyond those, beyond urban regions and beyond the middle classes, pet ownership has become a very, very big deal in Mexico, and it's now a very, very big industry as well, from a business perspective across the country. And particularly in Puebla City, Mexico City, that we're seeing this. In the rural regions, it is still mostly small holders on the slopes of Popocatépetl. So We don't see any major farms or even medium-sized farming enterprises close to the volcano. There's very few of them. They tend to be a little bit further away, but actually, the closest regions at risk, it is mostly smallholders who are living in communities there. So these are people who may have a few of different types of species that they're farming or using as working animals. So we've got pictures here. These are all taken from my fieldwork, some of the trips into the more rural zones close to the volcano. So working donkey here. We still have many street dogs. Mexico City does have a street dog population. It's not so large, but Puebla City has a massive street dog population. And then all the rural zones as well, there are a number of street dogs that are very much tied up with the human settlement, even if they're not necessarily formally owned by people. So horses, again, this is an image I took of someone who was trading horses. So he didn't actually live in the at-risk zone, but he would drive in to trade horses and ponies and working animals. We have some sort of smaller farming settlements. Cows were quite common in the area, and even fisheries. So these are outdoor growing fish tanks. Just one that I found there, but again, very much at risk, quite close to Popo itself, at risk from ashfall. So quite a diverse range of animal ownership, and alongside that, we have different human-animal relationships. Now, within the urban regions, although it's mostly a pet type of ownership relationship that we're talking about, even within this pet human animal dynamic, we're talking about a very different forms of how people view these animals. Some of these pets are still very much viewed as the more traditional guard dogs, so owning dogs as guard animals, and then all the way through to pets being really an integral member of the family. So even within these urban pet relationships, we can see quite a different owner animal type. And in the wake of this in the urban zones as well, we've seen, particularly in Puebla, I managed to go and speak to quite a few. There are many new animal charities that have been springing up in the past 5 years or so, partly because pets become so popular, partly because people are really concerned about the street dog population. They really do take an active role in these urban zones in, for example, improving and strengthening animal welfare laws. So they're very, very active, not just in rescuing street dogs or other animals, small animals, but really in trying to change the legal framework for animals in this area. One thing to note that I really picked up on during my research is that there's actually quite a tension between the rural and the urban areas in terms of how they view each other's animal ownership or human-animal relationships. So, I learned quite early on in my interview phase, which I'll come on to in a moment, to ask, for example, when I was interviewing people in the urban areas, what do you think about human-animal relationships in the rural zones, and then vice versa as well. And it was very clear, for example, that urban people who tended to be more middle class, the people I was interviewing, they really had quite a dim view of the affective relationships that might exist between people and animals in the rural regions. Basically, they don't really care about their animals; they're just there for economic. But they'll just abandon them. And of course, you go to the rural regions, and this is certainly not the case. Yes, these animals have worth, and yes, their relationship can be very different to that seen in the urban zones. But the affective bond is still incredibly strong. And as one interviewee said to me in a rural area, here we're working with our animals. I mean, we literally work with them day in, day out. So of course we have a very close relationship with them. But just to be aware, there is that tension going on there that I picked up on during my research. Okay, so coming on to the history of evacuation since Popocatépetl became active again. So there have been a couple of local evacuations when activity increased since 1994. And one of the key things that was noticed early on during these evacuations were that evacuation refusals and early returns were happening, and animals, needing to go back and feed animals or refusing to leave them to starve and die was a really key issue in these evacuations. Sorry, it's saying my internet connection is unstable, so I hope everyone can still hear me. There's been a lot of work done, particularly by the state level civil protection agencies in all 3 states that border the volcano. I went to speak with quite a lot of people on the Puebla side, the east side of the volcano, and there, there's a really close link between some of the individuals working with Protection Civil and the communities who are living closest to the volcano. So there's been a lot of effort put in. I've put an example here of a route map. So, for example, on this east side of the volcano, they're very aware that some of the communities don't really want to mix with other communities. So they've taken really good care to plan the evacuation routes so that these different communities are not going to mix with each other. They're going out on separate roads, on different roads. And this is really quite well developed, and they do have a good and active relationship with people who are living in these communities. Another thing that is worth mentioning as well is that animals are now included in these official plans for Popocatépetl. So Mexico is one of the few countries where even at a national level, so the National Disaster Agency, CENIPRED, recognizes the importance of animals in disaster. There is a lot of educational literature that's being put out. So, it's great to see this is happening, and animals have been included in POPO's evacuation plans. However, when you start speaking to people on the ground and asking about this, you begin to realize there are already quite a lot of issues. So for a start, there's this lovely formal plan drawn up where the number of animals in each community is labeled. The data for this is really quite patchy. Again, the census, people are certainly not disclosing how many animals they really have in the census, particularly not these more rural communities who will be more suspicious of the official census activity. Or again, this is only taking into account livestock species, not any of the other animals in the area. The feasibility of these plans is really quite contentious as well. So the plan is, we'll evacuate so many hundred animals along this route, but when you actually speak to people who would be involved with this, there's no plan for transportation yet to actually carry these animals out. The owners themselves don't necessarily have any transport to do this. And it's really unclear how this would work with the human evacuation going on as well. Some of these roads, given the number of people that need to pass along them, that there's not going to be a lot of space, and resource and time is going to be potentially limited if people need to get out quickly. So again, the feasibility is a bit questionable for these plans. Another thing I started to find as I was doing my interviews is that local communities are actually not particularly aware of these plans. After the initial evacuations, actually some communities developed their own local plans. So local corrals for animals, where perhaps just a few people would go back and maintain them. So some people are aware of these, but what they're not aware of is that these are not officially recognised in the evacuation plans anymore. So there's confusion there and perhaps a lack of communication. Another key issue that was highlighted during my interviews was that actually, some refuges have been identified around the volcano. So places where animals, particularly livestock, could be taken to and looked after. But there's a question really about the suitability. So for example, some people were concerned about the significant temperature difference. Obviously the altitude on the slopes of Popocatépetl is a lot higher than down in the valleys where these refuges are about 50 kilometers away. There's a significant temperature gradient at certain times of the year. It could be 20 to 30 degrees hotter down the valley, away from the slopes. Issues with that. How are they going to be fed? And owners, just generally a bit concerned that perhaps they wouldn't want to transport their animals so far away. So another thing that's been happening in the area, which I think is a very positive first step, in 2016, World Animal Protection, which is a major international charity involved with animals and disaster evacuation, amongst other things, they actually held a joint training event with CENIPRED, the National Disaster Agency, specifically focusing on, practicing animal evacuation, particularly for larger species. And they got the local vet school in Puebla, they got students from the vet school involved, helping, presuming that they would get involved as volunteers potentially. How do we get large animals loaded up onto vehicles, all this kind of stuff, which I think is very encouraging. However, it is worth noting that local communities, the event itself was done a very long way away from the volcano, relatively from the volcano itself. It's actually the other side of Puebla City. Local communities were not involved and not necessarily aware of this. And, I've said before as well, we've got this evacuation plan for transporting animals, but it sort of ignores or puts to one side the previous local corralling plans that local communities actually had. So that's thinking about the animals closest to the volcano, but what about the urban zones? Obviously, they're a bit further away from the volcano. So Puebla City is about 50 kilometers away. Mexico City is 70 kilometers to 100 kilometers away, depending on which side you're talking about. So obviously they're not necessarily, we're not necessarily thinking of immediate evacuation routes needed in these major urban zones. However, we may need to evacuate. And actually the earthquake happening the year before I went out, it was incredibly interesting to hear about the evacuation stories in the wake of this earthquake in the urban zones. And really, there were some key issues identified, something that Donelle's mentioned as very important in the Christchurch disaster, and that we know from the literature as well. We know it's important that shelters have to admit pets, and this definitely wasn't the case in Puebla or Mexico City for most of the shelters. And also lots of stories of people returning to unsafe buildings immediately after the earthquake to try and rescue their animals. So, we've got some very issues there we can really recognize from other previously studied settings, and this was certainly the case. Now, since then, my feeling is that particularly looking at the official literature and civil protection, they have recognised this and they are taking steps to try and improve this with their disaster education. So what about my research? So just to summarise this briefly, I hope I'm doing okay for time, Rory.
Sorry, just quickly, Mihai, you're at 21 minutes now, so just a heads up.
Oh, right, okay, I'll wrap it up then quite quickly. So my research, I've used a mixed methodologies approach. So I've based it upon an assemblages framework. Just to summarize this briefly, when we're talking about assemblages, we're talking about a framework that it really reconceptualizes the complex and dynamic interactions that we might find in a disaster situation. So rather than looking at causality, which the more traditional disaster risk reduction of assemblages framework allows us to look at agency, effect, and power. So I use semi-structured interviews. So I conducted these in 2018. The broad topics I considered were sort of perceptions of and responses to hazards, evacuation plans and health impacts from volcanic emissions from an animal-human perspective. And the key output themes I got from my thematic analysis were animal-geos interactions and mythologies, human-animal bonds, and shared human-animal volcanic health impacts. And I've used those themes then to design a quantitative online survey. I'd initially hoped to deliver this in person, but for various reasons, it's had to be delivered online instead. But I've listed here, so 5 key sections. So demographic info, measuring animal attachment using a pre-validated vehicle, considering perceptions of proposed hazards and volcanic expertise. And a key thing to mention here is, particularly in the wake of my interviews, I actually included animal knowledges, and not just looking at the knowledge of human specialists, but actually how do people view animals? Do they view their knowledges as relevant as, capacities for prediction for hazard, for example? And again, looking at animal health, how do people view volcanic risks for both human and animal health? And then seeing what people's views are for evacuation plans. So still waiting for the data analysis for this, so watch this space and hopefully we'll get that published in due course. So just to leave you with my key findings so far, I think there are lots of potential improvements for animal evacuation planning in this region, even if we don't have further resources. Obviously resources are always limited, but potentially relocating the refuges, improving education and communication, being aware that there are going to be affective impacts on rural people, and being a little bit careful of top-down only approaches, which has perhaps been a bit of an issue for the region. Being aware that animal hazard interactions and the related beliefs and mythologies are hugely important. This is something I found in my research, in my interviews here. Just to throw out, should we always discount animals as an early warning system, even if it doesn't have a scientific or a rational basis? And even if we do, perhaps animals can be a potential route for improved hazard communication. And then certainly there's a lot of potential for further study on volcanic health impacts on animals. And this would also have a lot of relevance for human health. A lot of the issues we see, such as respiratory, skin disease, for example, from ash emissions, applies just as much to people as it does to other species. So perhaps, a really good source of other data for us for health impacts from volcanoes. That's lovely. Thanks very much for your attention. Sorry for running on, folks, but just to acknowledge the key people. So my supervisors, Amy and Chiara, and also Professor David Demerit at King's, Dr. Irasima Kantara Ayala at UNAM, who's been really helpful in supporting me out in Mexico and giving me some access, and 2 of her students who were key helpers for some of my field work as well. Thanks very much for your attention.